The Holy Lance. A weapon also called the Spear of Destiny. The spear that is believed to have pierced Christ's side at his crucifixion. Let's go back to the origins, to the fateful day of his death.
He is to undergo an ordeal which prevails at the hands of the Romans. It's the Crucifixion.
Crucifixion, an extreme torture that was always fatal. So why the need for a spear? What evidence do we have of a spear was used against Christ? And do we know who used it? As incredible as it may seem, the Holy Lance has become sacred.
This spear is now a major relic.
Why has this instrument of death evolved into one of the most important relics in Christendom?
The relics of the Passion of Christ are incredibly rare, which makes them the most valuable thing.
We'll go in search of the Holy Lance, following its extraordinary journey, coveted and owned by some of the world's most powerful people: Charlemagne, St. Louis, Napoleon, and Hitler. We will travel to Vienna, Jerusalem, Paris, and the Vatican. On our journey, we will see how the very subject of the Holy Lance is controversial. Some even dispute its existence.
We have no idea if there was a lance, and if there was a lance, we have no idea where it is.
And others think that the relics of the Passion, including the Holy Lance, are real.
We know that they are still there, but we do not show them anymore.
We'll disentangle fact from the fiction, investigating one of the great legends of Christendom, the mystery of the Holy Lance. The story of the Holy Lance began over 2,000 years ago. Jesus of Nazareth died on the cross. According to the Gospels, a Roman soldier grabbed his spear and pierced Christ's side. His weapon, later called the Lance of Destiny, became a vital relic of the Passion, sacred because it came into direct contact with Christ. Ancient texts and even songs evoke the Holy Lance throughout the centuries. It is said to have passed into the hands of famous historical people. But what is it? Poitiers in 733. Charles Martel is said to own it when he crushed the Muslim army. At the beginning of the 9th century, the lance passed into the hands of Charlemagne. He fights 47 victorious battles with it at his side. In the 13th century, Louis IX, known as St. Louis, bought the Holy Lance from the Emperor of Constantinople, bringing it back to Paris. It then stays in Central Europe for 700 years. (1938), as the Second World War approached, Adolf Hitler seized it, taking it to Nuremberg. The treasure of the Austrian Empire is part of the large-scale looting of European art. After the war, the Lance of Destiny is found in a vault hidden by Hitler. In 1946, the American government returned it to the Austrians. Today, the lance is thought to be in Vienna. But the story of this spear is not quite so simple. Why was this relic so desired?
The object has a power as such, and firstly, gives its possessor an aura, and secondly, a significant spiritual and temporal power.
A symbol of power and righteousness, it's easy to understand why the Holy Lance was the object of desires. But how did this spear even first appear? And why was it used against Jesus Christ? What is the true story of the Holy Lance? To find out, we must trace its journey back through time, to the origins of Christendom itself. For the Roman authorities, Jesus was a troublemaker.
Make not my father's house an house of merchandise.
For Jewish leaders, Jesus questioned everything. The situation was no longer tolerable. Caiaphas, the high priest of Jerusalem, had him arrested.
He is guilty of death.
They decided to deliver Jesus to the Romans. As his crucifixion nears, so does the appearance of the Holy Lance. But when was the Christ's passion?
The era of Christ corresponds to the reign of Emperor Tiberius. The crucifixion dates to about the year 30, and while it is not totally certain, to the time when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea.
According to the Gospels, Pontius Pilate was forced to condemn Jesus under pressure from the Jewish authorities and the crowd.
What shall I do then with Jesus, who is or shall be released?
Crucify you.
The sentence was crucifixion.
He is to undergo an ordeal at the hands of the Romans. It's the crucifixion. That is to say, they attach the torture victim to some wood, then leave him there to suffer, sometimes for several days at the entrance of the city, so that all the enemies of the empire can see what awaits them should they have the misfortune to revolt against the Romans.
Jesus had to carry his own cross to a hill outside Jerusalem, a place called Golgotha, the place of the skull. In the four canonical Gospels attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, one can read the story of the crucifixion. But only in the Gospel of John does the Holy Lance take center stage.
One of the soldiers thrusts a spear into his side, and immediately blood and water spouts out.
In the 4th century, a book speaks of the centurion and the spear called the Gospel of Nicodemus. The Gospel isn't well known, but it is nevertheless of great importance, as it has been quoted in nearly 400 manuscripts, medieval encyclopedias, historical chronicles, and sermons. This is the first time the centurion is named.
The soldiers crowned him with thorns. He was flogged, and he received Pilate's sentence. He was crucified at the place of the skull with 2 thieves. He was made to drink sour wine mixed with gall before St. Longinus, the soldier, pierced his side with his spear.
But beyond the Gospel, what really happened during a crucifixion? What were the rituals? Is the use of a spear plausible? And was it part of the punishment?
The weapon that was used during Christ's Passion was simply used to check if the crucified were still alive or not. It was not a gratuitous act of cruelty. On the contrary, I would dare say it was almost humane.
Where Christ was concerned, this gesture was useless because he was already dead. But there is also a medical explanation.
It does involve also the rise in liquids in the chest area, so that piercing or the alleged piercing may have been there to release this pressure in the chest.
This would make explain the description in the Gospel.
One of the soldiers thrusts a spear into his side, and immediately blood and water spouts out.
Crucifixion, a cruel torture from the beginning of our era. During the Passion, Jesus Christ endured this torment without suffering all the violations reserved for the crucified. Nevertheless, his side was pierced by a lance, in vain, as Christ was already dead. This spear then became a holy relic. Longinus the soldier held it, and that day his destiny changed. Our investigation continues in search of the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side. Longinus was the soldier who held it in his hands that day.
The word lance, used in Greek, well, it's lonke. And so suddenly we say, look, the name given to this soldier is a name that derives from the word lance. And in the Christian tradition, that's probably where his name comes from. So we'll all call him Longinus.
The Christian tradition also says that when half-blind Longinus pierced Christ's side, he was covered in blood and water, and his sight was instantly recovered. But could a Roman soldier have been half-blind?
There was a miracle. It was that this semi-blind man recovered his sight. But we must see this as a symbolic blindness. He had not seen the new law, but he saw the old law. So he has a sort of revelation. It's in this sense that there is a miracle that is far more important than that of recovering his sight. In short, it is the spiritual view.
After the crucifixion, Longinus' mission was to protect the body of Christ, allowing no one to touch it. But after attending the resurrection of Christ, Longinus became a different man. He changed his life, gave up his weapons, and converted.
Here we're told that he's going to Cappadocia, though, that he decides to leave as an hermit, but he's persecuted for his faith.
He was arrested and forced to renounce his God, but he refused and was beheaded, becoming a martyr. The story of Longinus has been told throughout the ages.
We even canonize him, so he's called Saint Longinus, and in the West, the Roman Catholic Church grants him a very important status, perhaps precisely because he's a Roman. And we are, of course, in Rome. In the Vatican in Rome, we will not hesitate to erect a large statue, which will reach an incredible stature in Christianity, especially in the West.
And what stronger symbol of Christendom than the Vatican? In the 17th century, in St. Peter's Basilica, Bernini created niches displaying huge statues for the exhibition of holy relics, among which is St. Longinus' spear. Here, we clearly see the importance that the Church accords to St. Longinus. The soldier who became St. Longinus and his lance are anchored in the history of the Christian religion, from the Gospels to the present day. Jesus made sacred the object Longinus held in his hands on the day of the crucifixion. Now that we have seen the importance of St. Longinus and the Holy Lance in history, let's go in search of this mysterious relic. What has become of the spear of the illustrious Longin? Where is it today? Our quest brings us to Austria. This is where the Holy Lance is believed to be. The Museum of Art History in Vienna. We meet the person who watches over it. This is the Holy Lance of Vienna. It is part of the imperial jewels of the Holy Roman Empire.
The lance, which is here in Vienna, has been revered for centuries as a very important relic. St. Longinus' lance that struck the body of Christ. This is confirmed on the gold sleeve here on the spear, which bears the inscription Lancia Domini. It is the lance of Christ.
This spear has traveled an incredibly long way to reach us. In 1946, the Holy Lance was returned to the Austrians by the Monument Men. The Monument Men were 350 committed Americans, curators, and historians dedicated to the safeguarding of art. They discovered imperial jewels in August 1945 in a maze of underground galleries north of Nuremberg, hidden there by Adolf Hitler. For 3 days after the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany on March 12, 1938, Hitler had brought back this treasure from Vienna. At the beginning of the 19th century, with Napoleon waging war across Europe and his troops approaching the German city of Nuremberg, the Prussians decided to transfer the Holy Lance to their Austrian neighbors in Vienna. Did they still believe in the mystical powers of the Holy Lance, or was it simply not desirable for Bonaparte to possess this symbol of power? History does not give us the exact answer. On the other hand, we know that a simple messenger alone brought the spear to Vienna. After his victories against the Austrian Empire, Napoleon could have brought it back to Paris. But strangely, he didn't. If we go back in time to the 13th century, the Vatican designates this spear as an official relic of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Lance of Vienna has definitely belonged to many powerful characters, and ancient texts like the Song of Roland in the 11th century speak about it.
Charlemagne, by the grace of God, has obtained the tip and has it enshrined in the golden pommel. Because of this honor and grace, the sword received the name Joyful.
Legend has it that between the 8th and 9th centuries, Charlemagne won 47 battles thanks to the Holy Lance. A Holy Lance is also believed to have secured the foundations of the Carolingian dynasty because it is said that Charles Martel had it in his possession against the Muslims in Poitiers in the year 733. And previously, where was it? Well, the story of the Holy Lance of Vienna ends here in the 8th century. How can we be so sure? It has been studied in a laboratory, dated, and appraised by scientists. Its constitution leaves us in no doubt. It does not date from the 1st century.
The gold sleeve, found here in the window and bearing the inscription Lancia Domini, refers to the Emperor Charles IV and therefore dates from the mid-14th century.
Under the gold leaf is another sheet of precious metal that dates back to the 11th century, a sheet of silver. And under the silver leaf is a very traditional spear.
The spear is made of iron and was most likely manufactured in the 8th century AD.
In view of the results, scientists and specialists are in agreement.
The profile of the spear itself looks more like the much later Carolingian spears, rather than the Roman ones. So all this unfortunately does not coincide very well with the scenario according to which this spear is said to be authentic.
The Holy Lance of Vienna was forged around the year 700. then embellished with silver in the 11th century and gold in the 14th century. However, it is not the lance of Saint Longinus, the spear that pierced Christ's side. To trace the true Holy Lance, our investigation continues. We return to the land of its origin, Jerusalem. A Christian relic which is imbued with magical virtues, an instrument of power and greed that was once owned by famous historical characters. And yet, the spear of the Holy Roman Empire was not the spear of destiny. So, if the lance from Vienna is not the spear which pierced the side of Christ, where is the true Holy Lance? To find the Holy Lance, we head to Jerusalem, to Mount Golgotha, the place of the skull. This is where Jesus is believed to have been crucified and where the spear of destiny was used. Golgotha is also the location of Christ's tomb. It is protected by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In the first centuries after Christ's death, Golgotha became a sacred place of pilgrimage.
Already, around 170 AD, we find testimonies of Christian pilgrimages, notably an Asian bishop, Meliton of Sardis, from what is now modern-day Turkey. He says he will go to Palestine to see the place where the sacred events unfolded.
But it wasn't until long after the crucifixion that pilgrims sought out the places of the Passion and relics like the Holy Lance.
Since the 4th century, we started looking for holy sites. We built churches on the different places where Christ stayed, where he preached the Sermon on the Mount, where he multiplied the loaves, where in Jerusalem he followed the way of the cross, where Golgotha is. It is in the 4th century that we began to formalize Christianity.
With Constantine, the Holy Land, Jerusalem, becomes a place of Christian remembrance.
Helene, the mother of the Roman Empire Constantine and great supporter of Christianity, is said to have organized the first restoration of the holy sites by visiting them between 326 and 328 AD. On finding the Holy Lance and the other relics of the Passion, Helene strengthened Jerusalem as a leading pilgrimage site. But in 614 AD, the lance leaves Jerusalem because, like the other relics of the Passion, it needed to be protected.
We learn that it goes to Constantinople because Jerusalem is taken at that time by the Persians. The Persians take Jerusalem, and so suddenly we need to remove a certain number of objects, including the relics. It was at this moment that the spear would left Jerusalem and would have gone to Constantinople. Constantinople at that time bears this name because it is Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, who converted to Christianity in the 4th century. So, the city of Constantinople was at the time a sort of world capital of Christianity. That's where the spear stays for several centuries.
The Holy Lance is brought to Constantinople, known today as Istanbul, where it will stay for 600 years. In 1204, the Crusaders besieged and ransacked Constantinople. Miraculously, the lance seems to have escaped their clutches. A few years later, in 1241, Louis IX, who is better known as Saint Louis, takes the Holy Lance from the Emperor of Constantinople, Baudouin II, and brought it to Paris. Yes, the Holy Lance was brought back to Paris. But why would Baudouin II let go of such a treasure?
He parts with it because he is stuck in wars he cannot get out of. He simply needs to raise new armies, and he needs money. He will speak to St. Louis and tell him to go buy them and keep them in a deserving place.
As for St. Louis, what was his interest in acquiring these relics?
St. Louis was interested in these relics for several reasons. Indeed, this fact must be placed in the context of the Middle Ages, where the relics of Christ's Passion are unheard of. That is what gives them the most value, but the spiritual value is even more important for St. Louis, who wants to establish France's position in Western Christian Europe. France has arrived at an important point in its development, with 200,000 inhabitants. Paris is one of the most populated cities in Europe. There is a university, there is an important economic center, but there is still something missing in Paris.
St. Louis had one ambition: to give Paris spiritual grandeur and indisputable recognition.
St. Louis buys the relics from Baudouin II. He buys them in 2 lots. Initially, in 1239, he will buy the crown of thorns, and then 2 years later, he buys a fairly considerable set of relics.
In the second lot, we find the wood of the Holy Cross, a nail of the Crucifixion, and the Holy Lance.
The arrival of the relics, the great relics in Paris, this rather astonishing set that was bought by Louis IX from Baldwin II and that Baudouin II certifies in a charter in 12,047, is absolutely extraordinary and really turns Paris into the Western city with the most relics.
La ville d'Occident qui possède le plus de reliques et
Constantinople, which was the foremost holder of relics before this transfer takes place, is completely overtaken.
But this prestige, this new aura for France, comes at an exorbitant price.
He spends £135,000 to acquire these relics, which is half of the state budget.
But above all, what is important is that this amount is higher than the construction costs of the Sainte-Chapelle.
The Sainte-Chapelle cost £40,000. That's 3 times less than the £135,000 spent on the relics it houses.
So it is a very considerable sum, and I believe that one can measure through this sum the value of the relics to the man in the Middle Ages.
So, what did the Holy Lance really look like when it arrived in Paris? We searched for evidence in ancient archives. Incredibly, we found it.
Among these relics of the Sainte-Chapelle, there was the Holy Lance. The Holy Lance, or more precisely, a fragment of it. A relic is never the whole item, it's a small part. It's not an object that was spectacular in itself, so it was necessary to make it spectacular. That's why this small fragment was installed in a cross.
The fragment was too small to be displayed as it was, so it was enshrined in the center of this cross. This cross was then placed in a great reliquary with many of St. Louis's other acquisitions. It was then set at the very top of this platform, dominating the faithful.
The Holy Chapel was really built to house these relics, and then it kept them for an extremely long time.
So, the Sacred Lance has been preserved here for a long time. 550 years punctuated by great ceremonies. The kings, of course, attend and also celebrate extraordinary occasions for special characters in order to make them enjoy the virtues of the relics.
The lance stayed in Paris until the French Revolution, where it was taken with other relics to the National Library. Unfortunately, during this period, it was lost without a trace.
We also lose all trace of the lance of Jerusalem. A Vienna lance that turns out to be old, but not old enough to be from the crucifixion of Christ, a spear of Jerusalem that vanishes in the chaos of the French Revolution. But where is the Holy Lance now? Do we have any other leads? The Spear of Destiny is no longer in Jerusalem, has disappeared from Paris, and the Spear of Vienna does not date from the 1st century. We still have some ways of finding the Holy Lance, which is said to have pierced the flank of Jesus Christ, because we know several others, like ones in Krakow, Poland, Etchmiadzin in Armenia, and even lances in Izmir and Antioch in Turkey.
If we inquire, we realize that there are spears in Armenia and in Poland. It seems that everyone everywhere wants to stake a claim saying, I own the spear.
Even today, there are several places in the world in which holy spears are preserved.
They are numerous, but among the most notable is a spear in Krakow, Poland. It can be found in the treasure room of the Wawel Cathedral, a symbol of Polish royal power, but it dates from the 10th century.
Indeed, the holy spear kept in Krakow is definitely only a replica of the Lance of Vienna.
In Armenia, the Holy Lance of Etchmiadzin is still displayed in this country's religious capital in a wing of the cathedral. It has never been a weapon, but it is rather the tip of an ensign from the Byzantine period, in the form of a perforated rhombus of a Greek cross.
As for that of Etchmiadzin in Armenia, we can also exclude it, because the shape of this relic is very different from that of the Roman arms and spears of the Roman soldiers at the time of Christ.
In Turkey, 2 other so-called holy spears are enthroned in Antioch and Izmir, but no historian today supports the hypothesis that it may be the spear from the crucifixion of Christ. If none of these is the true spear of destiny, where do all these spears come from?
These are not Roman spears. I think I can even go as far to say that they are not real spears at all. They are ceremonial objects that were made by people who had no intention whatsoever of producing weapons that can be used in combat.
State objects. But do we know what the real Spear of Destiny looks like?
Here, in this reproduction, we see a horseman holding a spear, which is probably the weapon that Longinus, the soldier who was at the foot of Christ's cross, probably had. It is an extremely simple weapon, which has a long wooden handle with a very thin iron tip, intended to thrust as deeply as possible into the body of an enemy. As this document shows, we see a horseman who uses it as a throwing weapon. However, it was also used, indeed more frequently, by foot soldiers, held by hand or with both hands to stab the enemy and kill him.
In conclusion, the lances of Armenia, Turkey, or Poland aren't genuine. The real Holy Lance is not among them. This profusion of spears is amazing, to say the least. How can we explain it? The answer lies in how the relics were moved.
The great relics of the Passion have moved from Jerusalem to Constantinople, and then the Crusades encouraged and even developed this transfer to further west. After 2004 and the terrible ransacking of Constantinople, we start seeing many things moving to the west.
As the relics are of increasing importance in the religious world and among believers, everyone wants to possess or worship a relic. So they are fragmented.
Everyone wanted a relic, so we dismembered the holy bodies.
Pieces of the wood of the cross, there are several of them, pieces of different materials, which make up the relics. There can also be several of these.
So there are fewer spears than pieces of the cross of Christ or pieces of shins. So we obviously have a lot fewer relics from that point of view. I do not think it's the real problem when we refer to the multiplicity of spears. I think, moreover, that is due to the fact that in different places of Christianity, in the East, in the West, one feels the need at a given moment to have strong relics.
But we must also ask ourselves the following question. Why did the faithful want to own a relic like the Holy Lance?
This object has a power in its own right and gives its possessor an aura at first, and an important spiritual and temporal power. I think that's actually what is sometimes a bit difficult for our 21st century world to understand.
The need for relics was such that it was impossible to cope with the growing demand. So people had to find ways of multiplying them.
Since we did not have enough relics, in the end we had to create them. For instance, placing a small rag, a small piece of material, on the end of a stick, a rod, which one touches against the relic and in turn becomes a contact relic, which we can put in a reliquary. A contact relic has pretty much the same meaning as an authentic relic.
In the Middle Ages, mentalities were very different from those of today. It was possible to convey the power and the meaning of a relic. An object became holy merely by coming into contact with a real relic. Because it was possible to transmit this power, our Holy Lance of Vienna alone would have allowed the creation of 15 other lances. At the time, this was not a problem. Once the contact had been made, all these lances were considered in turn to be authentic.
The most intense period for trading relics was the Middle Ages. During this period, theft was not uncommon.
The relics are the subject not only of a trade but even of theft. And this thieving was allowed because it was the proper thing to do.
The theft of relics was no problem. On the contrary, an object stolen from an official place such as a church somehow certified its authenticity. But there was a fine line between theft and trafficking fakes, a line which at the time was blatantly crossed.
Everyone knows quite well that we have 4 little fingers of one saint, 5 skulls of another, so there are a number of these relics that are obviously fake.
We talked about the problem of relic trafficking, saying nonetheless that at one time there were a lot of relics circulating, so we trade them, we sell them, and we can also ask ourselves if the lens was not a victim of this trade.
Of course, the traffic was motivated by the power conferred by the relics, their spiritual power, but the market value of the object cannot be excluded.
One of the reasons we kept all this was the quality of reliquary work. All these relics were in reliquaries. These reliquaries were made of precious materials, precious stones, precious metals, a treasure. It was also a cash reserve.
And a relic placed in a public place generated regular income.
There are purely material reasons. Indeed, when you have relics, you have a place of pilgrimage. That is to say, you attract people. People who come, people who spend money.
But what did the church say? It seems that all this was happening literally with its blessing. But some people did try to stop these practices. Around the 4th century, St. Augustine was reproaching this trade with vagrant monks and the debates were lively in the Middle Ages.
This was the subject of much debate, especially Guibert de Nogent in the 12th century. The debate was centered on the fact that we had to be sure of the reality, the veracity of these relics.
The Vienna lance in the 8th century was named the Lance of Saint Maurice by the first Carolingians. Saint Maurice, a fighter of the faith from the end of the 3rd century, who would have had in his hands the Lance of Christ.
Among
the holy warriors, we have a major role for all Western kingdoms. You will have Saint Georges and Saint Maurice, and the Holy Lance of Saint Maurice was carried like a standard in front of the emperor's procession.
The people of the Middle Ages allowed the Lance of Vienna to change its name.
The Lance of Vienna was, for everyone, the Lance of Saint Maurice. But, covered with a gold sleeve in the 14th century, it was renamed the Lance of Christ. People at that time had no scruples and did not see where the problem of turning the Lance of Saint Maurice into Saint Longinus' lance was.
To understand the mind and mentality in these days, we did not question its authenticity. No, it was real. It was. Of course it was.
The real problem with St. Longinus' lance and relics in general is not so much whether they are genuine because, unfortunately quite often today, thanks to modern scientific methods, we carry out tests. Most of the time we realize that in most cases they are not authentic or we cannot prove that they are. So finally, we can never use them as proof.
We have understood that thought processes in the Middle Ages were very different from ours today. In the 21st century, we see things very differently. But does the Spear of Destiny still exist? To find out, we need to continue our investigations. Real or fake relics, numerous Spears of Destiny from Vienna to Krakow, via Eczmiadzin, Izmir, or Antioch, all historians agree. Even if these objects are respected and even worshipped, the lance of Saint Longinus, the spear that pierced the side of Jesus Christ, is not among them. But we have one more lance to examine, the Holy Lance of Rome. We are nearing the end of our journey in search of the Holy Lance. We saw that the lances of Antioch, Izmir, Eczmiadzin, and Krakow were not genuine. We surveyed Jerusalem, Vienna, and Paris, where its trace was lost. And so, we arrive here in Rome. Because the Holy Lance has been here since the 15th century. But how did it get here? Relics of the Passion leave Jerusalem in the 7th century.
And that would be the time when the lance left Jerusalem and went to Constantinople.
In the 13th century, St. Louis paid the Emperor of Constantinople for the Holy Lance.
He gives £135,000 for the acquisition of these relics, which is half of the state budget.
But surprisingly, in the 14th century, the Holy Lance is still said to be in Constantinople. How is this possible?
In the 14th century, for example, some observers say, I saw the lance both in Paris and Constantinople. So there are solutions to try to explain the fact that there are several lances in different places. One solution was to say, in fact, that it's the same spear, but that these are pieces of the spear. I find it interesting because precisely the word used in the Gospel to designate the word lance is a word that can simply designate the tip of the spear. So we can all imagine that we would have in one particular place a piece of the spear and in another place a different piece of the spear. In fact, it's the same spear, but it's just two pieces of the same spear.
Indeed, this hypothesis is confirmed by a number of historians. The Holy Lance of Jerusalem was broken up in the 7th century during the siege of the city by the Persians. The tip of the lance was brought to Constantinople, then bought by St. Louis in the 13th century, only to disappear during the French Revolution. The other part of the lance, also brought to Constantinople, had a very different destiny. (1453) is a pivotal date in the history of Constantinople.
The Turks will conquer Constantinople. They seize the relics, including the lance.
The Sultan of Constantinople dies in 1481, and his two sons, Bajazet and Zizim, quarrel over power. Bajazet prevails over Zizim, who goes into exile. Zizim eventually falls into the hands of the French, and still today, we have found traces in the Creuse region.
His stay is still materialized by the presence of the Zizim Tower, which is located in Bourganeuf.
The fact that Zizim is held in France is a rather good deal for his brother Bajazet, the master of Constantinople.
Bajazet is quite happy with the deal. In this geopolitics that is established, he pays a pension so that his brother does not return to intervene in the Ottoman Empire again.
As long as Zizim is kept away from Constantinople, there is little risk of a war between the two brothers. But an unforeseen event will change the game and have a major influence on the destiny of the Holy Lance. King Charles VIII of France delivers Zizim to Pope Innocent VIII in Rome. Bajazet is anxious to see his brother kept in Rome and away from Constantinople, so he offers to pay the Pope a great sum of money and an even greater highly symbolic object.
Bajazet will transmit the Holy Lance to Innocent VIII.
So, the Holy Lance changes hands and travels to Rome and the heart of Christendom, the Basilica of St. Peter. The Basilica will house the 4 most important relics of the Church in 4 huge galleries.
These are relics that have a great history. The Veronica, with the statue of the woman who, according to tradition, wiped the face of Jesus on the way to Calvary. A piece of the true cross, the head of St. Andrew, and also St. Longinus' lance.
In the 18th century, it is said that Pope Benedict XIV even commented on this drawing with the 2 pieces of the Holy Lance, that of Paris and that of Rome, and confirmed that they corresponded perfectly. If we still had doubts about the importance of the Holy Lance for the Catholic Church, we find, still in the heart of the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, this statue of Pope Innocent VIII, and in his hand, the Lance of Destiny. As for the fragment of the Holy Lance of Rome, where could it be today?
It's kept in St. Peter's. You know, they haven't moved it, but there is a difference. Now, they're not exhibited in ceremonies, or celebrations, or even on certain occasions on which they were shown to the faithful previously. Now we know that they're still there, but we don't show them anymore.
The last Holy Lance could therefore be there in the archives of the Vatican, still temporarily out of reach. We hope that one day we will be able to observe it and finally lift the veil on one of the greatest mysteries of Christendom. The Holy Lance, an object whose myth grew at the same time as the legend of its bearer, the Roman soldier Saint Longinus, canonized and now an icon of Christendom. An object of covetousness, an object of power and recognition that has gone through history. A spear that, like many relics, has exercised and still exercises real power over men. It is true that the relics supported the prayer and the faith of generations of believers.
The relic has the advantage of being able to gather together the faithful, the believers, around a strong, identifying symbol, and so it is obvious that for religious and political power, it is very important to be able to unite believers around an item as major as a relic, such as the Holy Lance.
But what is the truth behind the veneration of the relics?
In the hearts of men, the relics play the mediating role between mankind and God.
Relics are also a link to our own history. He who has no past has no future. The Holy Lances we have examined are visible symbols of the history of humanity. Man often needs tangible signs to gain in spirituality.